Welcome to Thinking Nations series, Thinking Historically, where we connect students to scholars and their research as they explore historical topics and arguments in their classes. Today, we are thinking historically with Dr. H. Paul Thompson, Professor of History and Dean of the College of Humanities and Sciences at North Greenville University. Dr. Thompson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here.
So to start, I like to have the historian engage with the same prompt that students will be looking at. And it asks students to evaluate the extent to which President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal improved the lives of African Americans. So how would you approach this prompt?
Wow, what a question. As I look at that, the first thing that comes to my mind is what is the definition of improve?
Hmm.
Um, uh, how would we know improve if we saw it, right?
Sure.
And so we have to sort of start there. Like, what does improve mean? So there's so many ways. Again, your question says, how do we, how did it? To what extent did it improve the lives? Well, what's involved in a life, right?
Sure.
There's a lot involved in a life, and so this question could, the obvious, sort of conspicuous go-to is to talk about jobs, right? Is to talk about
Mm-hmm.
employment. Right? The main problem was 25% unemployment when FDR was elected, or almost 25% unemployment. And basically, people just needed jobs. They
Right.
needed jobs for money, for food, for housing. And so the New Deal was about getting Americans back to work, but it was also right about giving Americans hope, even until they could get back to work, or hope that the economy would turn around. And so there's almost sort of a psychological and a relational aspect here, a component. Uh, Income, jobs, hope. So the question is, to what extent did the New Deal do that? Obviously, the New Deal was designed to do that for everybody, right? It wasn't designed for Black people. It was designed for all Americans, because all
Yeah.
Americans had unemployment. But what we know historically, it was true then and it's true now. Basically, at any given time in U.S. history, the percentage of unemployed working age African Americans is always higher, at basically any given age, than unemployed white Americans. Um, I think to begin to approach the question, I'd want to think about what was going on in the 1920s in the, if you will, the Black economy. What was going on in Black America, if you will. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so you still had, in the early to mid 20s, roughly half of African Americans lived in the South. Um, uh,
Right.
African Americans were still heavily rural, so there were tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and so you think about that. But um, and so we know that in the 20s there was all sorts of economic crises in farming in the South, um, and so. Um, I would think about, what did the New Deal do to help rural Black farmers that were in the South? Um, another aspect of this is to consider the fact that this is smack dab in the middle of what historians call the Great Migration, which begins um, somewhere around World War One, mid second uh, decade of the 1900s, and roughly, it started even before then, but right around World War One, and all the way through the 1940s, you have this massive move of over 1 million African Americans north, and heading either to the northeast, or more to the Great Lakes, like Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, those kinds of places. And then of course there's a movement out to California during this period of Southern Blacks. And so you had the Great Migration, and so that the nature of Black Americans in terms of where they're living, while many may be such a large percentage are Southern and are rural, you have an increasing percentage of African Americans that are urban. So then the question comes, what did the New Deal do for Blacks in urban spaces? Because the questions, the challenges, the problems vary. They're a little different if you live in a city, in a tenement, in a small apartment, shall we say, literally on top of each other, in a way that rural people don't live. And
Yeah.
and so there are both, opportunities and challenges there. And so I think, to get at this question, you'd have to look at the varied African American sort of daily lived realities. And you'd have to look at the backdrop. How were they doing in the 1920s leading up to? And the bottom line is, like I said, just like white Americans were suffering, Black Americans were suffering, and quite arguably more, because so many Black Americans actually, especially women, for example, were domestics. If some of the students don't know what a domestic is, that means someone that is a maid, a live-in maid, or maybe not a live-in maid. But it was very common for middle and upper middle class white families to employ African American maids in the North, in the South, in big cities, and so as white families lost the capital to do that, then Blacks became unemployed, and with the lower education rates, lower skill and training rates, there really weren't other opportunities for Black employment.
You know, you quickly took a very holistic approach to the prompt, right? Like you started to think about what is the role of the Great Migration? What does the Black economy look like in urban environments in the 1920s versus rural environments? We also know that historians tend to have certain areas of focus when they approach. You know, I'm going to look at the economic impact of a particular event or the social impact, right? We have social historians, economic historians, political
Yes, yeah.
historians, right, who have these different areas of focus. So, you know, you quickly go to this holistic approach. I'm curious, how might other historians take a prompt like that? Would every historian jump to this very broad um,
Mm.
uh, outlook, or would they actually try to specify the prompt a little bit given their own interests, and what might that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I for me, when I teach, to me, I feel like the foundational question in everything I do is every time I convey information to students, the basic question I have to answer. If I don't answer this, I feel like I've failed. I have to start with who cares? Why should I care? If I
Hmm.
can't answer why I should care, then I've not taught well. And so for me, I'm always looking at the big picture because life is all interconnected. Like no man is an island, but also no group of people is an island. And so um, we're related. So here's the thing. Your question is about the New Deal in African Americans. So I'm going to actually sort of go the opposite extreme, even zoom out more on you. So, for example, the New Deal, right, is a set of policies, right? Very specific policies. We talk about the alphabet agencies, the CCC, the AAA, and NIRA, and on down the list. So,
Hmm.
actually, I imagine historians thinking more broadly and saying, so, talking about not New Deal policies, unless you are, as you said, historians have different focuses. And so, for example, uh, there are historians that simply study, politicians, right? The decisions, the actions of politicians. Others are
Right.
more interested, sort of, in the masses, the social. So, in other words, I can see, to say the impact of the New Deal, you're specifically looking at federal policies and how they play out across America. I can see reframing this question and saying, how did the administration of FDR, right, which was 13 years
Hmm.
unprecedented, right, in American
Right.
history before or since, right? How did a 13-year administration um, uh, impact African Americans?
Yeah.
How did his approach to the presidency, to both Depression and World War II,
Hmm.
alter African Americans' relationship with the federal government? How
Hmm.
did it pivot even how the federal government going forward interacted with African Americans? How did it impact the Democratic Party's practices in terms of African Americans? So, I mean, I can imagine even zooming out more and thinking
Yeah.
about the whole administration of the president.
Sure. I want to pivot a little bit. So, in
Mhm.
talking about the experiences of Black Americans, during that time. You mentioned a couple groups of people, rural farmers and sharecroppers, predominantly in the South, and then domestics or domestic servants that were working both in the South and the North. And so I was kind of reminded of one of the particular documents that students are looking at, which is a testimony of a representative of the NAACP, Charles H. Houston. And he essentially points out the holes in the Social Security Act, which excluded both sharecroppers and domestics from these provisions, these benefits.
Right.
One, I think that this can be kind of illuminating to the experience that you brought up earlier. But I'm also curious, here we have a primary source, right? A document from the era during the New Deal, from an African-American man. What role do sources like this play in our research, and why should historians pay attention to primary sources in general when trying to draw historic conclusions?
So there's a quote from C.S. Lewis, who's everybody seems to love to quote C.S. Lewis for one reason or another. But he, in I think Magician's Nephew, he has a quote where he says something like, "What you see depends on where you stand and the kind of person you are."
Yeah.
And so I mean, historically, the nuts and bolts, the bread and butter, the brick and mortar. I mean, what historians do is historians read. So why are primary sources important? Well, first of all, it's the basic building block of the profession, of the history profession. But number two, when we have written words to go by, it is people hate this, but it's a perspective, right? It's what they see. So everybody can only see from the perspective. We're all limited creatures. None of us know everything. We can't be anywhere but one place at a time. So one of the things we do want to be careful about as historians, as much as primary sources are the building blocks of our discipline, just because I was there and saw it doesn't mean I know the truth. I think sometimes there's a perception that a primary source is like more accurate, or it is accurate as opposed to a secondary source. And that's not always true. Three different people can observe an event at the same moment in time and give you three different explanations of what happened, but they're all primary sources. And so a historian has to develop, these tools to analyze and make sense and interpret the primary sources they're reading. And each primary source is going to give us sort of, I also love the image of the story of what the four blind men describing an elephant. One feels the leg, one feels the trunk, one feels the side. What's an elephant like? Well, it's like the side of a building, and well, he's right. And the guy that feels the trunk, well, it's almost like a snake, the one that feels the leg, it's like a trunk of a tree. Well, they were all right. I mean, they're all describing an elephant, but describing something very different, even though it's all the same elephant. So, and so this is how the historian would think about primary sources and why we have to read multiple primary sources.
Yeah. And I love the emphasis on, yes, it is the building block for historical research, but it does not necessarily mean that this is the perspective that should be elevated, right? We need to corroborate it with other sources. We need to read other historians. Like what has a historian who, comes from a different era or background said about this? And
we have to study who wrote the source. We have to study who wrote the source. Who were they? Who were they? I mean, socially, politically, racially, gender-wise, who were they? Age-wise, I mean, all those things, if students watching this video, I mean, if you're 15 and you have a 7-year-old brother or sister, right? You can both be in the room at the same time, but you react differently. And, you might have reacted, when you were 7, like your 7-year-old brother, but you're not 7 anymore, but you have the same experience.
Yep.
but it's a different perception, a discernment of what's going on. And so this is the same reality with primary sources. All, even age. I mean, all these things impact how people are going to record and respond to an event, even see an event.
So something that's highlighted, right, in a lot of your answers, are or reveals the complexity of the study of history. Right, there's a lot to
Yeah.
consider, and in both our own perspective, the perspectives of who we study, how that relates to the very questions we ask. Right, what is the New Deal, or versus the
Yeah.
administration of FDR, more broadly?
Hmm.
So given that
Hmm.
complexity, what type of questions should students or could students ask about the impact of the New Deal, or FDR's policies more broadly, or his administration on African Americans, considering the various contexts that you brought up?
To me, the FDR's presidency was a turning point. It was a pivot point. Um, a lot of times, historians like to say, well, in a very simple way of thinking about the past, people often think about cause and effect. And one of the interesting things to me, as I learned more and more and studied history academically, I realized seemingly one of the favorite models a lot of historians will conclude is, rather than a simple line of "this caused this," which is the way I thought about the past when I was like in sixth grade.
Sure.
Um, so many historians, when they're looking at movements or groups of people or trends, so many historians think about, well, A caused B, but then B caused A.
Hmm.
And so they sort of see it as a self-perpetuating. It just goes on and on, sort
Right.
of self-feeding. And so I say that because, I mean, one of the things that's happening is that, so in 1902, the last African American in the U.S. Congress from the Reconstruction era uh, was left.
Hmm.
There was no African American in the U.S. Congress again until 1920, to the 28 election, and then he started serving in 29.
Wow.
Oscar D. Priest from Georgia. So, excuse me, from Chicago, Illinois. And so we had, so from 1902 to 1929, there was no African American in Congress. And then we have him elected, just a couple of years before FDR.
Yeah.
Um, and so there actually is a turn. And so scholars, when they're looking at the African American experience in politics, notice, I'm going to say, a sort of a slow, steady increase in every level, whether it's elected officials at the local level, state level, or federal level, or whether it's people getting employed or appointed to government positions. There starts being an upward trend. One scholar calls it a political resurgence of the African American in politics. Right,
Uh-huh.
right, the political resurgence. And so FDR feeds that. I mean, it starts before his election, but then he reinforces it.
Yeah.
And one of the most profound things is his, what people came to call, even in that era, the so-called Black Cabinet.
Hmm.
Several federal offices literally appointed highly educated, prominent African Americans who were well connected to simply be advisors about racial matters for that office, run by a white person, right? Right. But all these African Americans were advising. I mean, this was true in the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Department of the Interior, Department of Commerce, something called the Office of Civil Defense, the Office of War Information. I mean, multiple offices, they were hiring African Americans. And so these individuals had the ears of the highest level policymakers in
Hmm.
his administration, year after year after year. And so that just sort of fed this trend. So you could get letters like some of these primary sources you've included in your DBQ,
Right.
right? African Americans are writing to officials and saying, "Help us out. Help us understand what's going on. Can you advocate?" And this kind of thing. And this is new. No other president had appointed that many. And I think, one of the individuals you have cited is Harold Ickes. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention him, right? So a white man, head of the Department of the Interior, he was over most of those New Deal programs. What was he? He was a member of the NAACP and had been president of the NAACP Chicago chapter, right, before FDR appointed him. And he's appointing black people after black people, and as in one of these primary sources, is defending that yes, black people can lead, they can be in supervisory roles. I believe in them. And the NAACP was interracial from the beginning, but he was a very liberal white for his day, and
Huh.
had a great positive impact in moving African Americans. Over the course of FDR's administration, the number of black people employed by the federal government went up fourfold.
Wow.
Employed by the federal government, whether it be at high policy levels or whether it be at lower levels with less skills and less education. But
Mhm.
it went from 50,000 to 200,000 African Americans employed by the federal government.
Yeah, I think that'll be really helpful context for students to chew on as they look through the sources and understand what was going on at the federal level. To wrap things up, we like to just kind of get a pulse on why the scholar we're talking to does what they do. So I know that your primary area of expertise is around the history of prohibition. I'd love to hear a little bit about that in general and why. And then more broadly, what drew you to studying African American history?
Well, um, it's so interesting. As far back as I can remember, um, when I was a child, and I'd hear these stories, I feel like the line that, this general won this war, this pharaoh built these pyramids. Um, when I was a little kid, at some point, like early on, I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Like the general didn't go out there and physically win the war. There were all sorts of men dying on a battlefield,
Yeah.
using cannon, riding horses, shooting guns. And I'm like, what do they mean the general won the war? Like, I don't get it.
Yeah.
Like, what about all those people?
Yeah.
And to me, when I was a very young person, I mean, I believe pre-adolescent, I was just like, that's weird. Somebody should be studying like what the everyday Joe did. Like,
Mm,
like how did the actual guy who actually built the tower, like,
yeah.
how was he living? He's the one who built it, not the guy who was the boss. And so and I don't know how this clicked in me, but I've always been interested in just how the little guy lived. And of course, I'm African American, and in the United States, the more I learn our history, obviously African Americans have been historically um, um, less educated, historically not in prominent roles,
Mm,
historically not power brokers, as we might say today, or decision makers or kingpin makers, and so moving from being interested in the little guy, so to speak, to being interested in African Americans, sort of seamless transition for me. And the piece about why I studied prohibition and temperance. Well, I was raised in a religious home, in a fairly strict Christian home, where I was taught that drinking alcohol was a sin.
mhm.
And uh, the older I got, the more I realized everybody that claimed to be a Christian didn't believe or practice that.
Mhm.
And I think there came a point where I just increasingly became curious about the origins of that. And then by the time I came to apply to my doctoral program, I, I was more intrigued with how I wanted to study how race would play into movements like the movement to ban alcohol, which was a movement to improve society, improve people's lives. And I was curious how race would overlay religion in the name of let's make a better country, let's make a better world, let's make a better city.
Well, Dr. Thompson, this was a genuinely enjoyable conversation. I really appreciate you taking us to the high level and thinking through the complexities of the historian and historical study, but also kind of getting down into the details of Roosevelt's presidency and the Black experience in that presidency and how students might be able to think through that context as they engage with this material. So we appreciate your time and wish you well.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.